All right, well, if you've got a Bible with you this morning, you turn with me to Esther chapter 4. If you don't have a Bible, Greg's got some Bibles there in the back. Whenever you walk in, they're right inside the door on the left, so you can always grab one on your way in. We are in the book of Esther. We're in chapter 4. And it's going to be a little bit longer of a reading this morning, but this whole chapter is really key for us. This is like the central, kind of the turning point, the unveiling, if you will, of the whole point, the whole message behind everything that God has been doing in this story. Even though, we'll talk about this, even though God hasn't been explicitly mentioned yet in the book of Esther, he has been at work, and this is what it's all been building to and leading to at this moment. So would you stand with me as we read Esther chapter 4. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for the destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will hold fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went and did everything as Esther had ordered him. And we're just going to read the beginning of chapter 5. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room, opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Let's pray. This is God's word. Father, thank you for your word to us this morning. Lord, you tell us that your word is truth, and that it is living and active. This is not a dead book that has been just written by men throughout history, but it is your word that has been written to us from you, and that through it you show us truth. Through it you teach us. And this morning I pray, God, that you would open our eyes to see how a story that unfolded a few thousand years ago applies to our lives today. How it is so relevant to the things that either we've faced, we are facing, or we will face. Every single one of us can connect with what you have done at this point in history and see how it applies to our lives today. I pray that we would be able to see that, but not only that we would see it, but that we would bring our whole lives under the truth that's revealed in this passage. I pray it would transform the way that we see our reality, the way that we see our world. And that we would really be able to live in the freedom that we could find if we really understood and applied this to our lives. God, thank you that we are here this morning not by accident or mistake, that you've brought us here together for a reason. I pray that we would see that reason, that we would not leave here unchanged, but that you would transform and change us by your grace and truth through your word. In Jesus' name, amen. Go ahead and be seated. So over the last 3 weeks, I've had to attend 3 different funerals. 2 of them I had to officiate, and 1 I just had to attend. All 3 people were people that I knew personally in one way, shape, or form. I did a funeral yesterday for a 75-year-old man who I'd spent quite a bit of time with. He had dementia and lived a long, good life. When I was in Naperville, he'd come just about every week to come and sit with me in my office and talk to me. He liked to write, and he'd write music, and he was always asking for me to put music to his words that he had written down. And then last weekend, I just went to a funeral service for a woman who was in her 50s, who, faithful servant of God, had cancer. And then just a week, I think it might have been even the Friday before that, I did a funeral service for a young woman, 24 years old, who died from a brain aneurysm suddenly, unexpectedly. All 3 of them knew Jesus. All 3 of them got to go home and be with our Savior and King, but it's still hard. Hard for those families. And I tell you that not to depress you. It's a beautiful morning, and it's wonderful to be together. And I don't want to, almost hesitated to share that with you to start this morning as I saw the beautiful day out there. But I tell you that not to depress you, but because I want to bring reality into what we're talking about today. I think we live in a culture of escapism. A culture that's always trying to escape reality. I think it's the reason that entertainment thrives so much. Netflix and Vudu. And it's the reason people are alcoholics and addicted to drugs. Is there's this desire where we live in a world where reality is, it's hard. Right? Psalm 23, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. We live in a world of valleys that so many people are just trying to escape and avoid. And sometimes when we come to church, we try to use church as a place to escape reality. Let's just forget about it. Let's just kind of get in here and we sing songs and try to ignore all the stuff that's going on out there so that we can just kind of get lifted up, kind of get our high to a certain degree, or at the very least get a pat on the back so that we can go out and survive this next week. But what you need to hear this morning is that that is not God's vision for you. God's vision is so much bigger than that. It is so much greater than that. He isn't about you escaping reality, and He isn't about you surviving reality. He is about us thriving in the midst of our reality, whether good or bad. That we would actually thrive. And so we don't come here to escape it. We don't come here to get just a little pat on the back. We come here to bring our reality into the context of God's truth. It's our core value. The Word is the filter. What does that even mean? It means that the Word is the thing through which we see everything else. It's the thing that helps us understand our world. It helps us understand our lives. It helps us see. It's not that it transforms reality as much as it helps us see reality in a transformed way. And again, reality is hard, and we don't want to ignore that. And for some of you, you come here this morning, and that's your reality. You're in the middle of it. If you're not in the middle of it, you've at least been through it. But for some of us, we're here right now and we're in the middle of it, and it's not just funerals, and it's, yesterday afternoon, later on in the day after the funeral, I went and visited another friend of mine who just went into hospice because of an aggressive cancer. And it's not just sickness, it's the stress and the anxiety of job loss and broken relationships and frustrations in parenting, and you fill in the blank, whatever it is for you. Some of us are in the middle of it, and when we're in the middle of it, we tend to ask really major, important questions like, why? Why is all this going on? And right now it doesn't feel like it makes sense to you. You don't understand what's happening, and maybe if you were really transparent, what you have to admit to is that one of the questions you're asking is, where is God? I mean, if we went around the room, if we were really honest and transparent with each other today, how many of us would have to admit that we've asked that question more than once? In the middle of difficulties, in the middle of struggles, in the middle of challenges, to just kind of put your hands up in the air and go, God, where are you? That is the question that we're being forced to ask as we're looking at the book of Esther, in essence. As I said last week, and I mentioned just a few moments ago, as you read through the book of Esther, you see that God isn't mentioned, not explicitly. It's implied. There's things that are said where you know they're kind of referencing God to a certain degree, but never once is God explicitly mentioned. It's almost as if the writer who's telling us this story is going out of his way to avoid actually naming God and talking about his involvement. And I believe the reason he's doing that is to force us to ask a question. I mean, it seems so odd. It should seem odd to us that as we read, I mean, this is the Bible. I mean, you're coming here, this is where you get to learn about God and to grow into relationship with him and to get to know him more personally. You would expect that on every page it would be telling you about who God is, and yet here you come to Esther and you're going, I don't see, I can't find him. And if we're actually engaged in reading it, we have to ask, well, where's God? And here's the amazing answer. The answer is that even though he's never explicitly referenced, he's never named throughout this book, he is present on every single page, in every single moment, in every single instance, in every single situation, even though he is ignored, even though he is forgotten, even though they don't see him, even though they're not thinking about him, even though they're not even talking to him. God is personally and intimately involved in every single situation, in every single circumstance that he is working throughout this story for the good of his people. It's an amazing thing. That this morning, if you're here and you're asking the question, where is God? Is that even when you don't see him, even when you don't understand, even when it doesn't make sense, it doesn't matter if it makes sense, and it doesn't matter if you see him or understand. It doesn't change the fact that he is personally and intimately involved in your life. He is engaged and he is working in every single circumstances, even if it doesn't make sense, even if you can't really see how it all fits. When Sarah and I first got married, one of the things, we bought a puzzle early on. Remember that puzzle? We did finish it, didn't we? I think we even put stuff on it to hold it all together, but we got a photo mosaic puzzle. You know what those are? It's a big picture, but the big picture is made up of all of these little tiny pictures. You ever seen those? It's maddeningly, whatever. It's annoying. Apparently as annoying as that word is for me this morning. If you didn't have the big picture on the box, you probably never get it all together. Because all these little tiny pictures, and it was a picture of a butterfly. We had it at our coffee table before kids because, with kids, that'll never get finished. They'll destroy it or pieces will get eaten or thrown in the toilet. And so it took us forever. We finally did get it together, but it's such a great image of our lives. Because here's the way our lives are working. Our lives are made up of all of these little pictures. And you don't have the big picture. You don't have the box to look at to know, okay, well, that's, I can look and I can see that picture and I can look and see where that fits in, and you're putting the pieces in place. You're not in control. You don't have that box, but your life is made up of all of these little pictures, and God's got the big picture, and guess what He's doing? He's taking and He's working in every single one of those little pictures, and He's putting the big one together. And He knows the end picture even when you don't. He is personally and intimately engaged, and He is working in your life in all of the small pictures to put them in their place so that they all fit together into this beautiful masterpiece that one day you're going to stop and you're look back and you're going to go, oh, and now I see. That's the story of what we're seeing this morning in Esther. Remember, I'll just kind of catch you up if you're visiting this morning. The story of Esther is set in the Persian Empire. It's about 485 BC. It's in the city of Susa. The emperor is Xerxes. And at chapter 1, Xerxes throws a 180-day party where he invites all of his friends over, and the whole point of the party is to parade his wealth in front of everybody, show everybody just how great he is. And so they're doing that, and then partway through, they're partying probably a little bit too much, and he makes a really stupid decision. He decides to treat his wife as an object of his wealth. And so he sends a message to her and says, hey, I want you to come, because the men and women are celebrating separately. He sends a message to wife and says, hey, I want you to come over here with all the men, and I'm going to parade you in front of everybody so that they can look at you like my treasure and go, wow, Xerxes is so great. Stupid. And so he does it, and she refuses. She refuses, which is an extremely risky decision on her part, but she refuses to be treated as an object. Women, there's something you can learn from Queen Vashti. She refuses to be treated as an object, and the king, of course, goes into a fury and a rage because he's an arrogant, prideful man who demands that everybody submits to him. And his young advisors tell him to exile her from the kingdom, fire her from being queen, and so he does. He kicks her out of the kingdom, and he's in such a rage, he goes to war with Greece. He ends up losing. He comes back, chapter 2, it's about 480 BC. And he starts to feel bad about the fact, not for Vashti, he starts to feel bad for himself, I think, because he's kicked his queen out of the kingdom. And so his young advisors come to him and suggest that instead of inviting the queen back, they go around and they find all of the most beautiful women in all of the empire, and they bring them back to the palace, and they can parade them in front of her, and he can have his pick of the most beautiful. And it appeals to his pride and his arrogance, and again, that whole idea of treating women as objects. And so they go out through the kingdom to find the most beautiful women and enter the main character, one of the main characters of the story, Esther. Esther is a young Jewish woman who is living in the city of Susa. And the reason that she's in Susa is because about 100 years before that, her ancestors, her great-great-grandfather and many other Jews were carried off into exile. God had warned the people of Israel that if they continued to sin and disobey, and their sin and disobedience was to worship the gods of the nations around them instead of worshiping Him. He was the one who rescued them out of Egypt. He was their God. He was supposed to be their king. They were to serve Him and Him alone, and they continued to sin and disobey Him. He warned them. It was not a surprise. They may have been surprised, but it was because they weren't listening. And so they get carried off in exile, and that's the reason that she's there, is that her family's been living in the city of Susa. 100 years after the exile, she's there, and she's absolutely beautiful. But she's got a bit of a tragic story, because when she was young, she lost her parents. Both of her parents died, and she ends up being adopted by her cousin, whose name is Mordecai. Mordecai works in the palace. He serves there, so he knows the ins and the outs of how things work there. And so here is Esther, and the name Esther, literally, it means star. And Esther is a star in many ways, but again, part of it is because she's so beautiful. And so here are these men going around trying to find the most beautiful women in the kingdom, and they come across this young, Jewish, beautiful woman, and she's selected to be one of the many women that are brought to the palace to be picked by the king. And Mordecai, knowing the ins and outs of the palace, tells her, instructs her, says, when you're there, don't tell anybody about your heritage. Don't tell them that you're Jewish. You need to hide that. And so she follows his instructions, and she hides it, and through the process, it says that she finds favor. She finds favor with the people who are overseeing her, who are kind of doing the preparation to get her ready to go see the king, and they put her to the front of the line early on, and she gets chosen one night to go and see the king, and she goes to see him, and when the king meets her, he falls in love, and they're married. And she becomes, Esther, the queen of the Persian Empire. 5 years later, there's a man named Haman that gets promoted in the empire. We haven't heard anything about this Haman yet, and I said last week he's kind of the Jafar of the book of Esther. Right? You hear Haman and he's just kind of a slimy, he looks bad. He just looks bad. And so Haman gets promoted, and the promotion is he's promoted over everybody else, and what the king says is everyone needs to bow down to Haman in honor. But it's more than honor. What we know about Eastern culture at that time is to bow down to a ruler, in essence, it was an act of worship, because there was a sense in which they were seen as deity. They were seen as gods. And so promoting Haman was in the sense of giving him some of that honor and demanding that everyone do that. And so when he passes through the gate, everybody is supposed to bow down, but Mordecai, working in the palace, standing at the gate, refuses to bow down. He's the only one. And the reason he gives is because he's Jewish. There is a problem between bowing down to Haman and being Jewish. And the problem is that God says you should bow down to no other God. Even men who are seen as gods, you'd bow down to no one but me. And so Mordecai refuses. Haman finds out, and he gets furious. He gets filled with rage. And so he decides not just to go after Mordecai, but because Mordecai is a Jew, he decides he's going to go after all the Jews. And so he puts a plot together to annihilate all the Jews. He goes to the emperor, he goes to Xerxes, and he doesn't tell him that he wants to kill all the Jews, but he says, hey, there's a people who are living in your empire who really don't fit in, and they're not really following the rules, and I think we should kill them all. And Xerxes doesn't say, well, who are these people, and tell me more. Xerxes goes, okay, here's my ring, go ahead and make the law. And the end of chapter 3 is they sit down to eat. The law is made. Xerxes and Haman sit down for a meal. And the law gets sent out throughout the entire empire to say, we're going to kill the Jews, every single one of them, and they set the day. And by the way, the day that edict goes out is on the 13th day of the first month of the year, the day before the people of Israel celebrate the Passover, the day of their salvation from Egypt, the day of them becoming a nation of God's people. Not by accident, not by coincidence. And so here we come to chapter 4, and Mordecai finds out, and he is in mourning, and he is weeping. All of the Jews are mourning and weeping, except for Esther, because Esther is in the palace, and she has no idea what's happened. And so Haman comes to the gate in sackcloth and ashes. That's what they would do when they would go into mourning. They put on sackcloth and ashes, and here he is, and he's mourning. And Esther finds out, and they have a bit of a back and forth. She first sends clothes, just get changed, because she's assuming it's really you're overreacting. Right? No big deal, just get changed. And of course his response is to say no, and here's why. And so he sends word of what's happening and the fact that all the Jews are going to get killed, and he says, command her to go and talk to the king. And this is no small request, because he says, go and talk to the king on behalf of your people. Remember, Esther has hidden the fact that she's Jewish, and now Mordecai is saying, go to the king, tell him that you're a Jew, tell him about what's happening, and implore him on behalf of the people of Israel that he would rescue and save them. And this is a huge risk. Because Esther responds and she says, look, everybody knows. When she sends the response back to him, and she says in verse 11, all the king's servants and the people of the king provinces know that if any man, she's saying, listen, you know better than to ask me to go into the king, because if I go into the king and I'm not invited, here's what happens, I'm dead. Anyone who goes in without being invited, unless the king reacts and reaches out his golden scepter to save that person, the result is you're put to death. And so this is no small request. And Mordecai's response, I'm going to read it again, and I want you to read it with me. You don't have to read it out loud. I'll read it. You read it with me. Verse 13, then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther. So she's saying, listen, I'm going to be put to death. This is a huge risk. You're asking so much of me. And here's what he says. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews, for if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Mordecai asks her a question, but it's not a question, it's a statement in essence. He's saying, Esther, just stop for a moment and think about this. Is it possible that the reason that you are where you are and who you are, that you have a relation, you're the only person who has this kind of a relationship with the King? There is no one else. All of our lives are on the line. The entire Jewish nation, including yourself, will be put to death. Don't think you'll escape just because you're sitting on the throne. Is it possible that everything that has happened, all of those small pictures in your life that haven't made sense, up to this point in time, the death of your family, the fact that we're living in Susa, the fact that you got chosen to be a part of all of those women to be paraded before the king, the fact that you got chosen to be the queen, the fact that you are where you are, when you are at this moment, is it possible that it's not chance? Is it possible that it's not coincidence, but there is a reason? And this is it. This is the big picture. All of those small pictures have been put in place, and they've been fit together so that you could be at this place and at this time, so that you could intercede on behalf of the people to the king so that we might be saved. Is it possible? And again, it's not a question as much as it is really a statement. He's saying, think about it. Step back for a moment and see. And there's five things that I think that we need to take away from this as we look at our own lives, as we look at our own circumstances. And here's what they are. Number one, even when things seem out of control, God reigns. God is still on the throne. Number two, God is working right now for the present and future good of his people. God is working always in this moment for the present good of his people, as well as for the future good of his people. For us as his people, you are where you are and who you are, not by chance, accident, or coincidence, but you are there for a reason and a purpose, and it's God's purpose. Number four, when you are there for a reason, God has you where you are for a purpose, something he wants you to do. He will always give you what you need in order to do what he's given you to do. And then number five, I'm going to give you a different point than what's in your notes, okay? Here's number five, and it goes with what's there, but let me give it to you. Number five, you can miss the opportunity. You can miss the opportunity. And you have no idea what hangs in the balance of the choice that you're going to make in this moment. Number one, even when things seem out of control, God is always and continually on his throne. In this moment, Esther is absolutely taken by surprise. She has no idea. Here she is. She's in the throne room. Everything is wonderful. Right? She's not in the throne room, but she's in the palace, and she's got women who are taking care of her. She's the queen. Everything seems to have been going well. She has no awareness of Haman and of the conflict with Mordecai and the fact that Haman has put this plan together and he's sent out this edict to the entire empire, and that the entire Jewish nation right now is on the line and that the people are about to be annihilated. She's completely taken by surprise. And I can imagine that in this moment, her whole world seems to suddenly go into chaos and everything seems out of control. Tell me that you've never been there, where you're taken by surprise. You have something completely hits you out of the blue. You weren't expecting it. You weren't planning on it, and you're surprised by it. Here's what you always need to remember. When you are surprised, God never is. When you are taken off guard, God never is. When you are overwhelmed, God never is. There is never a moment when God turns his back and he's over here doing something, you're cooking, I'm kind of working on something over here, and suddenly God turns around and everything is in chaos and he's going, what happened? That never happens to God. God is always on the throne. God is always in charge. And listen, even in the most dark and difficult circumstances of your life, even in the midst of the greatest evil, God is always working and overruling that for good. Always. Even when you don't see it, even when you don't understand it, even when it doesn't make sense, God is always overruling evil for good. As one author put it, he says this, and boy, are these words very relevant to us today. We must not be discouraged when tyrants and flatterers seem to have their own way. The Lord reigneth. He has 1,000 ways of fulfilling his own purposes. He bringeth the counsel of men to naught. For we cannot forget that the evil counsel of Caiaphas, the greed of or ambition of Judas, the weakness of Pilate, the fury of the Jews, were all overruled for the salvation of mankind. Do you understand that? The greatest evil was overruled to accomplish the greatest good. The greatest evil of the cross, mankind's ultimate rejection of God, God overruled it to accomplish the greatest good, the purchasing of our salvation and of the new covenant of grace. God is never off the throne. It may seem out of control to you, but it's never out of his control. It doesn't mean that bad things don't happen. It just means that God is always working in such a way that he has the power to overrule the greatest evil to accomplish the greatest good. Look at Joseph in the book of Genesis. It's the easiest illustration that we could use or think of maybe. His brothers decide they're going to murder him because they can't stand him because he's kind of an arrogant punk. And so they decide they're going to murder him, but then one brother convinces them, no, let's not murder him. Let's just sell him into slavery. A little bit better. So they sell him into slavery. He gets taken off. He's in a house where he's serving faithfully, and his master's wife takes a liking to him and falsely accuses him of trying to seduce her because he wouldn't sleep with her. He gets thrown into prison. He gets forgotten. He ends up in Egypt. Can you imagine for just a moment that Joseph maybe felt like life was a bit out of control? Maybe when he was in the cistern and they're debating whether or not to murder him, maybe wondering where God is at that moment, or maybe when he's sitting in the prison cell going, how could God abandon me like this? But yet, at the end of the story, what does Joseph say when his brothers show up in Egypt? Do you remember the reason that all of that happened? Remember, all the small pictures didn't make much sense to Joseph, I would imagine. But when we get to the end of the story, Joseph sees the big picture. All of the small pieces get put into place, and Joseph is able to tell his brothers, hey, listen, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. God overruled your evil, and he used it for good. Why? Because God used their evil to get Joseph to Egypt because there was a famine coming that no one was aware of, so that Joseph could be there in Pharaoh's empire as like the second in command, so that he could make sure that enough grain was stored up so that the people of God, his family, might be saved. Where if he hadn't been there, and if he hadn't been aware, and if he hadn't put food in the storehouses for that famine, most likely they would have died. God provided. All along the way, he was working in Joseph's story, putting those small pieces together to get him to where he needed to be, when he needed to be, so that God's people might be rescued and saved. They had no idea what was going on, but God was never once off the throne. Life was terribly out of control in Joseph's perspective, and yet life was never out of control from God's side of it. When you are surprised, God never is. When you are overwhelmed, that never happens to God. God rules and God reigns. And he is always at work right now for the present and the future good of his people. Think about this for just a few moments here. Here is Esther as queen. Haman has plotted to destroy the Jews. And Esther just happens to be in the one place that is needed for someone to be in order for someone to go to the king and ask for him to save the people of Israel. You understand that first of all, that's not coincidence. And second of all, it didn't happen because of some great grand plan that Esther and Mordecai came up with together. It's not as if they were sitting around and they knew about Haman and that Haman was going to plot to kill the Jews. And so Esther and Mordecai are sitting around going, okay, so how are we going to save everybody? And Esther goes, well, what if I became queen? Mordecai says, that's going to be hard, but I think we can get it done. Maybe if Vashti gets kicked out of the kingdom, he'll be looking for a queen. There's no plan. There's no way they couldn't have planned it any better. This wasn't the result of human planning, that they had some ingenious idea knowing everything that was going to happen. Do you understand that in order for Esther to be queen in the Persian Empire at this time, all of the things that had to happen in order for her to be where she was, when she was, to be selected in order to be queen so she could go in to talk to the king when the Jews' lives were on the line, it started hundreds of years before that. For her family to end up in the city of Susa 100 years earlier, so that when she was born, she would be in that city. The fact that her parents died so that she would be adopted by Mordecai, who works in the palace, who understands the ins and outs. The fact that Mordecai even works in the palace. The fact that he's able to parent her and to show her how to live and to function as a a woman with integrity, even though she has failures and she has flaws, as we even see in this passage. The fact that she would even be beautiful enough to be chosen, to be one of, you're talking an empire of women to be picked from. And she's one of them. And not only is she one of them, but the fact that she would find favor so that one day she'd meet the king and that the king would choose her, a Jewish woman, so that she could be queen. Do you understand all of the things that had to happen that in no way possible could all of those things have just been coincidence? All along the way, God was working from moment to moment throughout her story, but he was working in the small pictures to bring all of those small pictures together to get the big picture in place so that when the time came and when the need was there, she would be in the right place at the right time so that the people of Israel might be saved. God is always working in your present small picture for your good, but he's also always working in the present small picture for the future good of you and others, so that he might bring you to the right place at the right time, being the right person to accomplish something that he has for you to do, which is point number 3. You are where you are and who you are for a reason. There are no accidents or mistakes. There are no accidents or mistakes. You may not have planned your story. You may not have put it all together and thought, boy, this is a great way to kind of follow this path, and I'm going to go from here to here to here, and this is the way it's all going to work together. You may not have planned it all, but the reason you are who you are and where you are is for a reason. All of the things that have happened in Esther's life have happened for a reason. They've all been working together and fit together in such a way that she would be where she is and who she is for a reason. Mordecai, it says, is it possible that for such a time as this, that you might be the queen of the Persian Empire, that you might have access to the very throne room of the king? And yes, it's a risk, but do you understand the king of Persia has fallen in love with her. He's been overwhelmed by the beauty of this woman. And Mordecai says, listen, there's no chance. There's no luck in this. There is a purpose and there is a plan in it. There's always this illustration that comes to my mind when I think about this, and most people that I talk to are like, what are you talking about? But I'm going to use it anyway. There's a movie that you should see, okay? And now I don't tend to suggest movies because it's always risky to a certain degree. Right? There's usually somebody that you're going to offend in the process. But I think this is a movie that is worth watching. It's a movie called Signs. Mel Gibson is in it. It's a movie by a guy named M. Night Shyamalan. You need to know up front, it's an alien movie, okay? But it's not about aliens. It's actually about faith. It's not about aliens. It's about faith. And the story is that this guy loses his wife in an accident. It seems like a freak accident. She's walking along the road, and all of a sudden there's a car that's coming on. There's only one car on the whole road. And here she is. She's walking on the side of the road, and all of a sudden this car, he falls asleep at the right moment, at the right time, so that he drives off the road and he hits her, and she dies. But before she dies, Mel Gibson's character, the husband, comes and he sees her, he talks to her, and she says some things to him before she dies. And it all seems chance. It all seems like it's everything, all of these coincidences, all these things that are happening. It's all these little pictures. And then you come to the end of the movie. And my wife will tell you, she actually probably doesn't know this, but she'll tell you, there's very few movies. I'm not a crier. Like, you very rarely will cry me. Just can't find me weeping in the corner or anything. But there are a few movies that bring tears to my eyes. And I'm going to cry. This is one of them. This is one of them. Because you get to the end of the movie and suddenly it all gets brought together and it all makes sense. And it's not coincidence, it's not chance, but it's a whole story of faith, because this man, the main character, Mel Gibson's character, is wrestling with faith the whole time. And it's this question, is God there and is God involved, or is it all chance, it is all circumstance? And the answer is no, it's not chance. God is involved. There's a reason for it. You are who you are and you are where you are for a reason. There is a plan that's going on. God has something for you to do. And listen, when God has something for you to do, when you are there, God always gives you what you need to accomplish what he's given you to do. When Esther finally goes into the king, she says, hey, everybody's got to pray. And I love the fact that it's the first time that we find in this book that people pray. Again, God isn't explicitly mentioned, but the idea, of course, is very clear. We got to go to God. They're finally going to God, but again, they're surprised. Whenever you're surprised and you go and pray, you need to always remember this. When you're telling God, it's not as like God's going, wow, thanks, I had no idea. That doesn't mean don't go and tell God. He wants you to talk to him about it. But in talking to him about it, you're bringing it into the reality of the fact that he's on the throne. They go and they pray, and she goes into the king, and what happens? It says there's a specific phrase, and it's in verse 2, and when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. That phrase, there's a uniqueness to it in the book of Esther, and if you go back to chapter 2, you'll find it again. In chapter 2, when she's selected to be one of the women, 3 times, I think, in 4 verses it says, and she found favor, and she found favor, and she found favor. I need you to hear this. Finding favor for Esther wasn't by chance. It was God giving her the favor that she needed to get to where she needed to be to do what she needed to do. The reason that she was given favor in this moment wasn't just because she's Queen Esther, wasn't just because she was in the right place at the right time, it was because God gave her that. Proverbs chapter 27, verse 1, I think I've got it here. 21, verse 1, it says, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. It wasn't chance. It wasn't coincidence. It was because God was in charge and God was giving Esther what she needed. And listen, God could have, when they prayed, God could have answered and he could have worked it out in such a way that the king reached out to Esther and said, hey, I haven't seen you in 30 days. Why don't you come on in? I'd like to talk to you. But he doesn't do that. God doesn't make it easier for Esther where she doesn't have to walk by faith. God will always give you what you need, but he never promises to give it to you before you need it. He gives it to you in that moment. God waits until Esther steps out in faith to be obedient in that situation, in that moment, to give her what she needed in order to be able to go to the king and say, here's what we need. So often we're unwilling to move until God gives us what we need. And God is saying, I'm going to give it to you, but you have to actually follow me first. God will always provide what you need, and you need to hear this last point. Listen, God will give you what you need to accomplish what he's given you to do, but there is a risk, and the risk is that you miss the moment, you miss the opportunity. You do not understand what hangs in the balance of being obedient and following God's call in your life in this moment. You don't know what hangs in the balance. The consequences if you fail and the blessings if you succeed. Mordecai says, listen, don't think that because you're on the throne, there won't be consequences if you don't fulfill God's purpose for your life. And by the way, they've got a very solid illustration in Haman. And let me just give it to you very quickly here. I didn't say this last week, but in chapter 3, when we meet Haman for the first time, it says he was Haman the Agagite. And most of the time, we read that word and we go, okay, whatever, I can't even pronounce that, and we move on. But that word is actually very important. It's extremely important. Sometimes you read it and you'll study it, you'll never find out. But this one in particular, the fact that he was an Agagite is so significant. And here's why. Because if you go back to Samuel, in the time of Saul, when Saul was king, he was given the responsibility of leading the people of Israel against the nations in the land. God was giving them the promised land, a little bit at a time, and Saul was supposed to lead the people of Israel against these nations. And one of the nations was the Amalekites, who were diametrically opposed to God, and God commanded Saul to take the people to lead the army in, and they were to destroy the entire nation, to leave no people living, no descendants, no one. God has called Saul at that time and that place to accomplish a specific purpose. And do you know what Saul did? He failed. He didn't just fail, he chose no. It wasn't an accident, it was intentional, because here's what he did. He let the king live. And you know what the king's name was? It's not a great name, but it was the name Agag. You see, Haman was a direct descendant of that man. And he was descendant of that man, and he was a curse on the people of Israel because Saul, in the moment where he was called, the place and the time where he was decided to disobey. And here we are hundreds of years later, and Haman is here plotting the destruction of the entire Jewish nation. So you don't know what hangs in the balance of that choice to say no. God has opened doors. He's put you right where you are for a reason. He's given you an opportunity, but what you need to always remember is open doors don't stay open. God gives you those moments and you can miss it. But listen, when you follow through, when you're obedient, God says, I'm going to provide, I'm going to give you through, and you have no idea the blessings that God wants to pour out on you and through you when you are willing to follow through. And you're willing to do what God has given you to do where you are, when you are, for the reason that God has put you there. When things seem out of control, God is always on the throne, and He is always working in the present for the present and future good of His people, you. You are where you are and who you are for a reason. God has something that He has for you to do in this place at this time, and He will always provide what you need in order to fulfill that purpose, but you can miss it. And the responsibility, the challenge is, if God's put you here and He's going to give you what you need, trust Him and obey. Let me just give you a few quick things. Number one, here's what that means. We got to be able to trust Him when we're in the small pictures. Some of you are in the small picture right now, and it doesn't make any sense, and you can't see the picture. And in essence, in this moment, God is saying, can you just hold on? Just step back. I'm not asking you to, you're living in the tension, but can we trust Him? That's the question you've got to ask and answer. And what God is saying is, you can trust me. It's not always going to make sense, but it's Romans 8:28. He really is working all things together for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His will. It's not just a nice statement. It's not just a platitude. It's a reality that when it sinks in, when it penetrates our hearts, it changes the way that we live. It doesn't take away the hardness of life, but it always fills the hardness with hope. If you're in a small picture today, or if you're in a small picture tomorrow, if you have yet to understand the why, whatever it is, a death, a loss, a challenge, a sickness, an illness, whatever those valleys are, they're never meaningless. But if you don't have the answer why, here's what you can know. You can trust the one who does. He's got the picture, and He knows what He's working towards. Number two, you can stop worrying about tomorrow. As a professional worrier, I am talking to you and to me in this moment, and I want us to understand what worry is. Let's just recognize it together, not as someone who's looking down on the worriers in the room, right? My mom was a worrier, and my dad was very thorough. When we'd leave the house and go on a trip, my dad would always triple check every single thing to make sure it was done before we would leave, and I inherited both of those, and so I like to say I'm a thorough worrier. For the worriers in the room, listen to me. Number one, let's recognize we often think of worry just as fear. I want you to think about it as pride. Do you know what worry says? Worry says, I know what the future should be, and I think God's going to get it wrong. Number two, worry is a lack of trust. Trusting that God is going to show up when tomorrow comes. You aren't trusting Him. I'm not trusting Him. I'm sitting around going, well, is God going to show up? Is He going to get it right? Or maybe it's all going to fall apart? And number three, here's what we're ultimately saying. We're saying we can't take God at His word. We can't trust Him. Because here's what you know. God has promised that you can do all things through Christ who gives you strength. He will give you what you need when you need it. You know it to be true. You can't do anything, right? You can't fly. You can't leap over tall buildings in a single bound. But if God brings something into your life, He'll give you what you need in that moment to live victoriously in Christ. You know it to be true, but your worry says you're not sure you can trust it. Let's together hear this for a moment. You and I are unqualified for the position of God. And the good news is that position is already taken by the one who is truly qualified, God Himself, who knows everything, is all-powerful, and loves you more than you can understand. You can actually rest. I can rest. You can rest. We can rest. We can rest. We can rest. We can rest. Listen, your worrying does nothing because you don't even know what the future holds. It could be better or it could be worse, but at the very least, here's what you know. Whether it's better or worse, God is always going to show up and He's always going to give you what you need. Because He's the one who's in charge of all the small pictures, bringing the big picture together. Number three, you need to be aware and ready to move when God calls you. For we, Paul says in Ephesians 2:10, we are God's workmanship created in Christ Jesus to do good works that he prepared in advance for us to do. God has things that he has prepared for you to do for such a time as this. If you're going to walk through those doors, if you're going to take those opportunities, you have to trust him, and you also need to be watching and aware and ready to move when the opportunity presents itself. He has good things for you to do. He has good things for me to do. And those opportunities are going to come all along the way. Yesterday, so I had a funeral in the morning yesterday, a wedding in the evening, and then I went to visit my friend in hospice. And it's smack dab in the middle of that. I've got things to do. I didn't go home. I was in, I had stuff to do. But in the middle of my stuff to do, somebody came in and interrupted. And I could have seen it as an annoyance. I could have been like, listen, I'm busy. I've got stuff to do. I had the wedding. I got the funeral. I had the funeral. I've got the wedding. I've got to go see my friend. I don't have time for you. But you know what? This woman that came in and was talking to me, I had her son back in youth group who had wandered away from the Lord. And at that moment, at that time, our paths crossed. It wasn't like she knew I was there. They crossed at that moment. And you know what she needed? She needed someone who could say, hey, listen. God is in charge. God has a plan and God has a purpose, and he is good. And I know it's painful, and I know that you probably feel all this guilt and shame and feel like it's all on you, but you could be the best parent and have a kid walk away from Christ. You could be the worst parent and have a kid follow Christ. At the end of the day, that your son's journey is in God's hands. You can rest easy. You got to be ready to move when God opens the doors. To trust that he's going to provide. And here's why you can have that confidence. You can have that confidence because God sent the greater Esther, who came into the world at the right time. Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, to give his life, not just at the risk of his life, but at the cost of his life, so that we might be saved from the greatest enemy, the enemy of our souls. That we might be adopted as children, and because we're his children, you know what that means? You and I don't need to be afraid. The enemy does. That we can walk with the confidence of knowing our King is on the throne and our King is coming again. And the victory that is his is ours today and forever and ever and ever and ever. Would you join me? Let's pray together.